Hello everyone, as always I'm Vlad Sparastoria and I know a thing or two about where to shoot. Today we're looking at the Bernardelli P1 in .40 Smith & Wesson caliber. Bernardelli is a company whose firearms you sometimes come across. However, there's something very important to say to tell this story. It's a defunct company. Bernardelli no longer exists. They haven't produced anything since '97 when they went bankrupt and were actually sold to a Turkish company. However, Bernardelli was a historic Italian company whose roots go back as far as the 1700s, and it contributed with many projects and designs to the history of Italian firearms manufacturing. Perhaps the last major attempt to secure an important government contract was when Bernardelli proposed, for adoption by the Italian army, what was essentially an adaptation of the Israeli Galil. However, that competition was won by Beretta, which went on to build the R7090 for the Italian army. Bernardelli has historically made excellent rifles, but did they ever shy away from making pistols as well? One of these pistols, the last one they ever designed, let's say, we've seen it, is the P018 series, and we've seen the sport version. The Bernardelli Practical, in a video here as well, the Bernardelli Practical would be produced until 1994, when an improved model would be introduced, which is exactly the Bernardelli P1, which is actually the last pistol ever designed and sold by the company from Gardone. It's like saying it was their last attempt to stay on the market. Shortly after that, in fact, they would go bankrupt and the company would cease to exist. With the Bernardelli P1, the company went back to the classic lines they had already experimented with on the P018 or the Bernardelli Practical. However, it introduced many small improvements, such as serrations here at the front of the slide to allow for racking the slide with a more forward grip, which is a bit more modern. I really like this feature. I don't really like grabbing the slide back here, but I can still grip it up front here. For example, it introduced the double action trigger, which the Practical, that we've already seen on the channel, didn't have. It has a single action trigger. By the way, this is a very interesting trigger, which we'll take a closer look at during the shooting test. It introduced, as you can see, the hammer stop with a safety that also works as a hammer stop. In my opinion, in this pistol, especially in this version, there's a clear desire in a way to compete with the Beretta 90 series or those other pistols that were spreading rapidly in the 1990s, which featured characteristics like lightweight alloys. We still haven't really reached polymer yet. At this point, polymer is still a relatively new technology, and some companies are still experimenting with it. But in fact, we have the classic pistol from before the 2000s. Here it is, double action, squared and aggressive look. In this sense, it somewhat resembles the SIG 226, and as we said, double action. And the hammer. This one in particular was made in .40 Smith & Wesson caliber. The first Bernardelli P018S were only made in 9mm or in 7.65 para, which was still quite common in Italy at that time. Whereas with the new frame that was made for this firearm, they also opted for a caliber that was relatively popular in those years. What can I say? Let's move the camera and take a close look at how this last breath of a company was made, unfortunately heading towards bankruptcy. So let's finally take a close look at this. Bernardelli P1. How do we know it's a Bernardelli P1? As always, it's written on the firearm. We see the very simple Vincenzo Bernardelli logo and the name of the weapon. We also notice, clearly written on the left side, the caliber. If we turn the firearm, we find a slightly more complete designation. Apart from the fact that it's stated again on the barrel that this is a 40. And Wesson, we also see Vincenzo Bernardelli, or rather V. Bernardelli, Gardone, Valtrompia, made in Italy. We also find the old catalog number, back when there was still a catalog. What are the controls on this weapon? Well, actually, if you're familiar with double action, single action pistols with a decocker, you know, the classic pistols from the 1990s, you'll quickly get familiar with this one too. Aside from the obvious trigger, which, as we said, works in both double and single action, we have, back here on the trigger, the magazine release. By the way, the magazine, looking at it, seems identical to the one from the Beretta 90 series. In fact, the magazine from the Beretta 90 series fits, but it doesn't want to lock in. Because actually, the only difference I can see is the shape of this notch, where the magazine actually locks in. So, very similar, and it seems a bit like what Taurus did. Even the Taurus magazines are almost identical, but not completely identical. By the way, I also have a Taurus magazine. Let's see if this one fits. This one doesn't latch either, so all the magazines are identical and don't latch onto each other. Anyway, as you can see, the magazine also has the Bernardelli logo with the swan they use as a symbol. We've already seen the magazine release. Then we have a safety lever that can simply be engaged, as you can see. I engage the safety like this, and I can carry the weapon in what's called condition 1, basically just like a Colt 1911. This, as you can see, completely locks the slide, literally just like on the Colt 1911. Very nice, very interesting. But pushing it further, it works as a hammer block. It's actually a pretty stiff hammer block because it's hard to show you, but it gives a clear kickback to the thumb that operates it. So it's almost painful to use it. I'm not joking, because it's really a very strong push downward. Because, as you can see, it returns to its safe position. As you can see, the hammer is dropped and the safety stays engaged from here. Actually, I can try to pull the trigger, but as you can see, the safety blocks everything. Obviously, to shoot, I have to disengage it, and in this way, I have double action. I definitely like this Baticane more than its direct competitor, the Beretta 98. By the way, I also repeat this during the shooting test. Many features you find on pistols like this are clearly made to compete with the Beretta 98, which, especially in those years, was a standard not only in Italy but internationally as well, for what a 9mm pistol should be. Then, of course, we also have the hold-open lever that we can activate. It's hinged, let's say pinned here, but it extends far enough back to be easily accessible. This feature will also be useful for disassembling the weapon, a feature that we can see very clearly. Here are the full-length slide rails. We'll see them much better as soon as we disassemble it. This is a feature that many consider important for safety. This ensures that the slide always moves with the same characteristics. Because the firearm having moving parts, in order to be accurate, these moving parts must return to where they were. Of course, it's a more complex solution and it can increase the cost, but it's definitely a benefit for accuracy. For example, owners of firearms like the Česká Zbrojovka Shadow or the good old SIG 210 know this perfectly well. To disassemble it, we need to remove the hold-open lever. Now, the gun doesn't tell us clearly how far back we need to pull the slide. The point where the hold-open fits into the gun must line up with this notch, which is actually the catch for the hold-open itself. So pull the slide back until you see this notch aligned with the point where the hold-open lever is attached. This way, it will be easy to pull it out. As you can see, this is exactly where it needs to come out. This isn't particularly complicated. So let's move the slide forward, and this way we can separate the frame of the gun from the slide, barrel, and recoil spring assembly. In this, the disassembly is absolutely classic and in line with almost all the Browning systems that we know so well. Look again, as you can see very well here. The full-length guide rails are there to control the movement of the slide as much as possible, so that there is as much precision as possible. Let's take another look at the firing of the weapon. By the way, we can also see the disconnection mechanism quite well. The trigger mechanism is very reminiscent of the Beretta 98. If we pull the trigger, the slide moves because, as you can see, at this moment the trigger is not disconnected. There's nothing. When the slide moves, it pushes the disconnector down, holding the hammer, and as you can see, the hammer is re-engaged. And only by releasing the trigger is it possible to fire another shot. This ensures that the pistol fires only and exclusively in semi-automatic mode. Disassembling, of course. The slide from the rest is quite simple because we just need to remove the guide rod with its recoil spring, and we can take out the barrel and separate it from the slide. As you can see, here we are dealing with the modified Browning system. This slot is very reminiscent of the Browning High Power or the Czeska Zbrojovka 75. What I find interesting is that the locking lugs are a mix of old and new, where the Colt 1911 has two lugs on the barrel separated by what is the chamber. Here, Bernardelli uses both a separate ring and the ejection port itself as a second locking lug. For example, we find unique locking lugs like this in firearms such as Glock, because this way they make use of already existing parts. It should be said that this firearm was also designed for powerful calibers like the .40 Smith & Wesson, so having extra locking surface is never a bad thing. As you can see with the right lighting, you can clearly see the rifling of the barrel. The barrel, as you can see, has the feed ramp. It's a barrel. So, taramped, it has an integrated feed ramp to help guide the rounds from the magazine into the barrel itself. In the slide, of course, we find the lugs for the locking lugs, and of course, we also find the breech face. And something very important, you know how much I love it, the firing pin safety. The firing pin safety, which, by the way, is a fundamental part of the mechanism for decocking the hammer. Because unlike, for example, the Beretta 98, which has a separate part of the firing pin that is rotated away together with the safety, here the hammer block safety is quite rudimentary. Because what the safety actually does is decock, that is, release the trigger. But still, since I haven't pulled the trigger, I haven't engaged the safety up L. It's this one here, because this goes up when I pull the trigger. To let the striker pass, when I use the safety, that doesn't happen. In short, the striker hits its safety. Very rudimentary, in quotes, as a system, but clearly very effective. And this is actually, as far as our disassembly goes, at this point, I would say we can go ahead and reassemble the weapon. Because obviously we need to test it on the range. Here we are, we've reassembled the recoil spring. This way we can put the weapon back on its rails. Let's pull it back. Wait, here we go. It has to fit in then. Stina here. Let's pull it back a little. It fits perfectly. And now the weapon is ready to use. Let's go try it out, and here we are. On the shooting lines of the National Shooting Range of Legnano. Where are we testing this? Bernardelli P1 of the 40 Smith & Wesson. We're using 165 GR Gecko rounds. I can tell you that even though it looks massive from a distance, it's surprisingly light as a pistol. We insert our magazine, we've loaded 10 rounds, racked the slide, and here we are, ready to shoot. Forgive me, but the camera had turned off. Lately, it does that a bit too often with the concussion from the shot when I hold the gun too close to the camera. Forgive it. It's almost 10 years old. Maybe it's time I buy a new one. I've been putting it off for a long time. Let's continue. Okay. So first impressions. The weapon, despite the .40 caliber, which I don't like and consider unnecessarily snappy, but I'll explain why I don't like the .40 Smith & Wesson. I've already made a video about it where I talked about it extensively. I discussed it thoroughly. The sights are very nice. The pistol feels good in the hand, although there are two things that bother me a little right here. The grip is very thick and squared. It feels very 1990s. It's a silly thing, but when I wrap my hand around it, I get the impression that I'm not using my whole finger because of this squareness. But as I've said 1,000 times, remember that my feelings are my own. We have very different hands. The ergonomics of a weapon and how it interacts with your hand is fundamental. But it can be different for everyone. And so I'm saying this for myself, because for the rest, it's perfectly fine. Some people might really like it. There's something about the trigger that drives me a little crazy, but maybe more. It's a matter of practice, meaning it has what's called a trigger reset collapse, which is the movement the trigger makes after firing. It seems pretty long to me. I mean, when it fires, I still feel my finger pressing while the gun recoils. Some people might like it. Honestly, I'm not sure and not prepared to answer. Whether this is adjustable, most likely it is, because often these pistols can be easily adjusted, either by a gunsmith or certain things like that can be changed. I found it marginally annoying, for me, oddly enough. Light triggers, because a fairly light trigger doesn't even drive me crazy. I actually prefer a pretty crisp trigger that I have to overcome with a pull. A certain conviction, relative conviction, of course. It fires and it's still there. We shoot and we try again. The Bernardelli P1 is a pretty interesting pistol because it was made by a company that no longer produces these weapons. So you can't really find many spare parts anymore, but these pistols are still around, and they often come at a great price for a completely good performance, so it's quality for the price. Actually, as of today, in 2025, they're in really, really good shape. These are more or less the same conclusions I reached when talking about its direct predecessor, the Bernardelli Practical, which this one follows right after the Practical from 1994. And they don't have much of a market for this reason, because over the years, different models have come out. Models that perhaps for the sport shooter integrate different ergonomics. They integrate small elements of modularity, such as interchangeable backstraps, the possibility to mount an optic, adjustable sights, and so on. The world of shooting has moved forward a bit. However, for the price at which these pistols are available, they are excellent weapons. I've seen it for sale around for even 300 euros, honestly. For that price, it's probably the best weapon you can buy. As for sport shooting, you have to wonder, of course, if the caliber is the right one. The .40 Smith & Wesson is increasingly falling out of use. There are people who still defend it fiercely, who like the .40 Smith & Wesson, and I defend their right to say they like it. In an asylum, maybe of course the 9 would make a bit more sense today. There are many of those guns that are created and don't shine, like maybe the more famous, more interesting, more well-known models. But still, the fact that they didn't shine in history doesn't mean they're such bad guns. And the Bernardelli P1 is definitely an example. Thank you all for watching this video. As always, remember that these videos are made by you who support me, you who suggest that I film these guns. Like today, for example, the Tesson of Legnano. Without the help of people like you, running my channel would be impossible. If you want to support me, consider leaving a like, a comment, and subscribing to the channel. I assure you it really helps a lot. If you want to help even more, but maybe you don't have firearms to offer me or let me try, consider buying the channel's t-shirts or subscribing. This gives you access, for example, to exclusive early content and directly supports the channel. Because I assure you, people think, there are people who think I'm Chiara Ferragni. You don't make any damn money by showing firearms on YouTube. Trust me. Ask other influencers in this field and they'll give you exactly the same answer as me. That's all from me for today. And as always, I'll see you next time.